The scratching at my door came with the wind, soft, desperate, like something dying. Should have known right then that letting her in would change everything. I set down my coffee and listened. Storm was howling something fierce outside my trading post, snow piling up against the windows like God's own fury. Been through plenty of blizzards in these Arizona mountains, but this one had teeth. The scratching came again, weaker this time. I opened that door and she collapsed right into my arms. Young Apache woman. Couldn't be more than 20, wearing nothing but a torn deerskin dress. Her lips were blue as winter sky, frost covering her black hair like morning lace. She was barely breathing. As I lifted her unconscious form, something made my blood run cold. Old cavalry rope burns circled her wrists like bracelets of shame. Beneath that dress, I could see the telltale scars of someone who'd survived things that would break most folks. Old Pete shuffled over, took one look at her parfleche bag, and whispered urgently, "Boy, you better see what she's got hidden in there, and you ain't gonna like what you find." Been keeping this trading post for near on 7 years now, ever since I hung up my cavalry saber and decided I'd had enough of taking orders from men who never bled for what they believed. The Mogollon Rim ain't exactly society, but it suits a man who's got reasons to keep his distance from civilization. Me and old Pete, we carved out a decent life up here. Him with his coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, me with my ledgers and the kind of quiet that lets a man forget things he'd rather not remember. Trading Post sits right at the edge of Apache country, dangerous territory for most folks, but we'd built ourselves a reputation for fair dealing and minding our own business. That particular evening, Pete was stirring the fire and going on about the weather. "Storm's gonna be a killer, Zeke," he said, squinting out at the gray sky. "Ain't seen clouds like that since the winter of '74. I was checking our supplies, making sure we had enough flour and coffee to last if we got snowed in for a week or more. Always paid to be prepared up here. A man could die real easy if he let his guard down. You remember what happened to them cavalry boys got caught in the open during that last big storm?" Pete continued, warming his hands over the flames. "Found 'em 3 days later, froze solid as fence posts." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. Earlier that day, I'd found strange tracks in the snow around the post, unshod pony prints and moccasin marks that looked fresh. Someone had been watching us, circling our place like a wolf studies a henhouse. In this country, that usually meant trouble was brewing. "Pete," I said, pointing toward the window, "you see anything unusual today?" "Any riders?" The old man shook his head, but his weathered face got that look it always did when something didn't sit right. "Nope, but I got that feeling in my bones again, like when the air gets heavy before lightning strikes." I knew what he meant. 20 years on the frontier teaches a man to trust those feelings. The Apache had been stirring lately. Word was that some cavalry units had been conducting raids on sacred sites, taking what they called artifacts from museums back east. Government boys called it preserving history. Apache called it grave robbing. Made my stomach turn, if I'm being honest. I'd seen enough of what war does to people, enough of what happens when one group decides another group's sacred things ain't worth respecting. That's part of why I left the army. Got tired of following orders that made me feel smaller as a man. As the afternoon wore on, the wind picked up something fierce. Snow started falling in thick, heavy flakes that meant business. Pete busied himself checking our firewood supply, while I secured the shutters and made sure our animals were safe in the lean-to. By evening, the storm was howling like a banshee. We settled in by the fire with some beans and hardtack, listening to the wind trying to tear the roof off. That's when Pete started talking about the old days, the way he always did when the weather turned bad. "Remember that Apache camp we stumbled on back in '72? He asked, stirring his coffee. "The one where they had all them bones laid out proper-like with beads and such?" I remembered. Sacred burial ground. Captain had ordered us to collect what he called specimens for the Smithsonian. I'd followed orders then, but it left a taste in my mouth like I'd been chewing on copper pennies. "Them Apache, they take that kind of thing serious," Pete continued. "Grandmother's bones, sacred bundles, medicine objects. Heard tell they'll track a man for years to get that stuff back. Blood debt, they call it." The old man's words made me uneasy, especially with those tracks I'd found earlier. Apache didn't usually travel in winter storms unless something was driving them, something important enough to risk their lives in weather that could kill a man in hours. I was about to respond when we heard it, that soft, desperate scratching at the door, barely audible over the wind, but persistent, like something or someone was using their last bit of strength to get our attention. Pete and I locked eyes across the fire. We both knew that sound could mean a lot of things in this country, and most of them weren't good. Could be a wounded animal, could be a trap, could be someone genuinely in need of help. But something about that scratching tugged at my conscience, reminded me of the sound a child might make, or someone too weak to knock proper. "You gonna answer that?" Pete asked quietly. I stood up, hand instinctively moving to the rifle by the door. Whatever was out there in that storm, I had a feeling it was about to change everything. That scratching came again, weaker now, like whoever was out there was using up their last reserves of strength. I grabbed my rifle and moved toward the door, Pete right behind me with his old Colt. "Could be a trick," Pete whispered. "Apache been known to use wounded women as bait." I nodded, but something in my gut told me this was different. The scratching wasn't coming in any kind of pattern, just desperate random attempts to get attention. If it was a trap, it was either the best acting I'd ever heard or genuine desperation. I cracked the door open, rifle ready, and peered out into the swirling snow. At first, I couldn't see anything but white chaos. Then the wind shifted, and there she was, collapsed against the doorframe, dark hair plastered with ice, wearing nothing but that torn deerskin dress. "Jesus Christ," I breathed, lowering the rifle. She was unconscious, barely breathing, and from the blue tinge to her lips, she'd been out in this storm long enough to be near death. No horse, no supplies, no coat, just a young Apache woman who'd somehow made it through miles of killing cold to reach our door. "Don't do it, Zeke," Pete warned. "You bring her inside, you're asking for trouble. Apache women don't travel alone, especially not in weather like this. Where's her people?" It was a fair question, and one that should have given me more pause than it did. But looking at her lying there, frost covering her like a burial shroud, I couldn't think past the simple fact that she was dying. "Can't leave her out here, Pete. She'll be dead in an hour. And we might be dead come morning if this is some kind of setup." I understood his concern. We'd both heard the stories, Apache warriors using every advantage they could find, including the natural inclination of white men to help what appeared to be a helpless woman. But looking at her, I couldn't see any deception, just a human being who needed help. I made my choice. Slinging the rifle over my shoulder, I lifted her unconscious form and carried her inside. She was lighter than I expected and cold as a mountain stream. Her breathing was so shallow I had to watch close to make sure she was still alive. Pete shook his head but started stoking the fire higher. "You always were too soft-hearted for your own good," he muttered. "Hope it don't get us both killed." I laid her down near the fireplace, close enough to the warmth but not so close she'd get burned. That's when I got my first good look at her condition. The rope burns around her wrists weren't fresh, but they weren't old either, maybe a few weeks. Someone had tied her up, and from the look of it, she'd fought those bonds hard enough to cut herself. There were other scars too, old ones. Marks on her arms that looked like knife cuts, and what appeared to be an old bullet wound on her shoulder. This woman had seen violence, survived it, and somehow made it through a killing storm to our door. "Get me some blankets," I told Pete, checking her hands and feet for frostbite. "And heat up some water. She's half frozen." As I worked to get her warm, I noticed something that made me pause. Her hands weren't soft like you'd expect from someone who'd been a captive. They were calloused, strong, with the kind of muscle tone that came from hard work or other activities. The fingers were long and graceful, but there was strength there that didn't match the helpless appearance. Still, frozen was frozen, regardless of who she was or what she'd done. I wrapped her in blankets and positioned her so the fire's warmth could reach her. Pete brought over a pot of warm water, and we started the slow process of bringing her back from the edge. It was while I was warming her feet that she first stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and for just a moment, her dark eyes met mine. There was intelligence there, awareness, and something else. A quick, evaluating look that seemed to take in everything about our situation in just a few seconds. Then her eyes closed again, and she seemed to slip back into unconsciousness, but I had the distinct feeling she'd been more awake than she was letting on. "She coming around?" Pete asked. "Maybe, hard to tell." What I didn't mention was the way her hand had moved slightly when our eyes met. A subtle shift towards something concealed in her clothes. It could have been nothing, just an unconscious reaction, but it could have been something else entirely. As I continued trying to warm her, I found myself wondering about Pete's warnings. Who was this woman? How had she ended up alone in a storm that would kill most grown men? And why did I have the growing feeling that letting her through our door had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped? Outside, the wind howled louder, and I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. Come morning, the storm was still raging, but she was alive. I woke to find her sitting up by the fire, those dark eyes watching me with the kind of careful attention a wild animal gives a potential threat. She'd wrapped the blankets around herself tight, and though she looked stronger than the night before, there was still something fragile about her. "How you feeling?" I asked, keeping my voice low and non-threatening. She didn't answer right away, just studied my face like she was trying to read something written there. When she finally spoke, it was in broken English mixed with Apache words I didn't understand. "You? Help," she said quietly. "Why?" It was a fair question. In this country, Apache and white folks weren't exactly known for helping each other. More often than not, we were trying to kill each other. But sitting there in the firelight looking at this woman who'd nearly died at my door, the old hatred seemed like someone else's problem. "Because you needed help," I said simply. She considered this for a long moment, then nodded slightly. It wasn't trust exactly, but it wasn't fear either. More like a careful acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't planning to hurt her. Pete stirred up some breakfast, coffee, beans, and hardtack that would keep body and soul together. I offered her a plate, and after another long look, she accepted it. We ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. It was after breakfast that I noticed her feet were in bad shape. The frostbite hadn't gone too deep, but her toes were swollen and discolored. Without thinking much about it, I heated up some water and brought it over. "Let me see," I said, gesturing to her feet. She pulled back at first, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a white man touching her. But when I just sat there, patient-like, with the warm water and clean cloth, she slowly extended one foot. The frostbite was worse than I'd thought. Her toes were badly damaged, and I could see she was in considerable pain, though she wasn't showing it. I'd seen enough frostbite in my cavalry days to know how to treat it. Gentle warming, careful cleaning, and patience. As I worked, something strange happened. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she stopped watching me like I might suddenly turn dangerous. It was the kind of trust that comes not from words but from actions, from one person taking care of another without expecting anything in return. "Hurt?" I asked, looking up at her. She shook her head, though I could see it did hurt. Apache didn't show pain easily. I'd learned that much in my army days. But there was something else in her expression, surprise maybe, that I was being gentle. When I finished with her feet, I offered her some clean clothes. Nothing fancy, just an old shirt and pants that would be more practical than that torn deerskin dress. She accepted them with a small nod and retreated to the far corner of the room to change. It was while she was changing that Pete pulled me aside. "You notice anything strange about her?" he asked quietly. "Like what?" "Like how she moves. That ain't a woman who's been helpless her whole life. Look at her shoulders, the way she holds herself. That's someone who knows how to fight." I glanced over, and Pete was right. Even dressed in oversized clothes, there was something about her posture that suggested strength, training even. But I'd seen enough broken people to know that strength could come from surviving terrible things. "Maybe she's had to learn to fight," I said. Maybe she's here for reasons we don't understand yet." When she came back to the fire, she'd braided her hair back and rolled up the sleeves of the shirt. She looked more comfortable, more herself, whatever that meant. We spent the rest of the morning in a kind of careful companionship, sharing the warmth of the fire, the simple pleasure of being alive while the storm raged outside. It was near noon when something shifted between us. I was mending a piece of harness, and she was watching my hands work the leather. Without thinking, I offered her the needle and thread. She took it, and her fingers moved over the leather with the kind of skill that spoke of years of practice. As we worked together in comfortable silence, she did something unexpected. She reached over and placed her hand on my chest, right over my heart. It was an Apache gesture of trust. I'd seen it before, but feeling it directed at me after everything that had happened between our peoples, it hit me like a physical blow. For just a moment, we sat there connected, two people from different worlds who'd found something human in each other. Then she pulled her hand away and went back to her mending. Outside, Pete was checking the perimeter. When he came back in, his face was grim. "Zeke," he said quietly, "we got company. Tracks all around the post, fresh ones. Someone's been watching us all morning, and they ain't left despite the storm." That night, after she'd fallen asleep by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Pete's warning about the tracks gnawed at me, and every time the wind shifted, I found myself listening for sounds that didn't belong. While she slept, I made a decision that would haunt me later. I examined her belongings. The parfleche bag Pete had mentioned sat near her makeshift bed, innocent enough looking. Just decorated rawhide, the kind Apache women used to carry personal items. But when I carefully opened it, what I found inside made my blood run cold. War paint. Red and black pigments in small pouches, the kind Apache warriors used to prepare for battle. Below that, wrapped in soft deerskin, was a knife unlike any I'd seen. The blade was perfect steel, sharp enough to shave with, and the handle was carved with symbols that meant something important to someone. But it was the last item that really stopped me. A medicine bundle wrapped in sacred cloth, containing objects I recognized from my cavalry days. These weren't just any Apache religious items. These were the kind of sacred objects that warriors carried into battle, the kind that meant life or death to the people who owned them. I sat back on my heels, pieces clicking together in my mind. This woman hadn't stumbled onto our trading post by accident. She was here for a reason, carrying warriors' tools and sacred objects that suggested she was on some kind of mission. As I was rewrapping the items, trying to make it look like I hadn't disturbed anything, she spoke from behind me. "Find what you were looking for?" I turned to find her sitting up, fully awake, watching me with eyes that held no trace of the helpless woman from the night before. The change was startling. Her posture was different, alert, ready. This was someone who could take care of herself. "Couldn't sleep," I said, which was true enough. "Wanted to make sure you weren't hurt worse than you were letting on." She studied my face for a long moment, then reached for the parfleche bag. Instead of being angry about my snooping, she seemed almost relieved that the pretense was over. "You know what these are," she said, pulling out the war paint. "Some of them." She nodded, then did something that completely changed the dynamic between us. She removed the knife from its wrapping and held it casually in her hand, not threatening exactly, but making it clear that she was far from helpless. "I am not what you think," she said, her English suddenly clearer, more precise. "What are you then?" "Someone with a task to complete." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just any Apache woman seeking shelter. This was someone on a mission, someone trained and prepared for something I didn't understand yet. "What kind of task?" She was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of something larger than both of us. "Sacred things were taken from my people, things that belong with the bones of my grandmother. I have come to bring them home." The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. The recent cavalry raids on burial sites, the stolen artifacts Pete had mentioned, the tracks around our trading post, it was all connected. She wasn't here by accident. She was here because she believed we had something that belonged to her people. "Why here?" I asked. "Why our trading post?" "Because this is where the trail led." Before I could ask what she meant, Pete burst through the door, his face pale with urgency. "Zeke, we got bigger problems. Signal fires on the mountain peaks, Apache war party moving this way, and that ain't all." He glanced at the woman, then back at me. "Cavalry patrol coming up from the south. We're about to be caught between two armies." The woman's hand tightened on her knife, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned determination. Whatever her mission was, she'd known this moment might come. "How long?" I asked Pete. Storms breaking up. Maybe hours, maybe less. I looked between Pete and the woman, understanding dawning on me like a cold sunrise. We weren't just caught in the middle of a storm anymore. We were caught in the middle of something much more dangerous, a conflict between Apache justice and military authority, with sacred objects somewhere in the mix. The woman stood up, knife still in hand, and walked to the window. She looked out at the clearing sky with the expression of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her whole life. "The waiting is over," she said quietly. Outside, the wind was dying down, and in the distance, I could swear, I heard the sound of horses moving through snow. The storm broke just after dawn, leaving behind a world crystalline and dangerous. The silence that followed the wind was almost worse than the howling had been. Too quiet, like the moment before lightning strikes. We didn't have long to wonder what was coming. Around mid-morning, the sound of a single horse crunching through snow announced our first visitor. I grabbed my rifle and positioned myself at the window while the woman melted back into the shadows like she'd never been there at all. The rider was young Corporal Davies, barely 20 and green as spring grass. His cavalry mount was breathing hard, and he looked like he'd been riding through hell to get here. I knew Davies from my army days. Good kid, followed orders, believed in doing right. The kind of soldier I'd been once, before the world got complicated. "Mr. Hawthorne," he called out, dismounting near the door. "Official business, sir." I opened the door, keeping the rifle visible but not threatening. "Davies, what brings you out in weather like this?" He pulled out a leather dispatch case, his hands shaking from cold or nerves. "Got orders from Colonel Brennan, sir. We're conducting a search for stolen government property." The words hit me like ice water. I kept my face neutral, but inside, pieces were clicking together. "What kind of property?" "Apache artifacts, sir. Sacred items taken from a military transport 3 weeks ago. Colonel believes they're somewhere in this area." Davies looked around nervously. "Also got orders to detain any Apache found off the reservation." Behind me, I could feel the woman's presence like a held breath. She was listening to every word, and I had no doubt she understood the implications better than Davies did. "Haven't seen any Apache," I said, which was technically true. "What kind of artifacts are we talking about?" Davies consulted his papers. "Bundle of bones, supposed to be some kind of medicine objects, painted ceremonial items, worth a considerable sum to the right collectors back east. There's a substantial reward for information leading to their recovery." The description made my stomach turn. These weren't just artifacts to be bought and sold. They were sacred objects, probably including human remains that should be resting in peace. The kind of grave robbing that made decent folks sick to think about. "You expecting trouble?" I asked, nodding toward his sidearm. "Colonel says the Apache will stop at nothing to get these items back. Calls it a blood debt or some such." Davies shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I served under you in the field. You always dealt straight with the Apache. What do you think about all this?" It was a fair question, and one that put me in an impossible position. Davies was asking for my honest opinion about a situation where honesty could get us all killed. "I think," I said carefully, "that people tend to value different things for different reasons. What the Army calls artifacts, the Apache call sacred, makes for complicated situations." Davies nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I was afraid you'd say, sir." He was about to leave when something made him pause. "Sir, you wouldn't happen to have seen any unusual tracks around here?" "We've been following sign for 2 days, and it led us in this direction." "Tracks get covered up pretty quick in weather like this," I replied. "Yes, sir. But the thing is, these tracks were fresh this morning. Someone's been moving around despite the storm, and that takes considerable skill." After Davies left, I found the woman standing by the back window, watching the tree line with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. "How much did you understand?" I asked. "Enough." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "They speak of my grandmother's bones like things to be sold." "Is that what you're here for? Your grandmother's remains?" She turned to face me, and I saw something in her eyes that made me understand why Apache warriors were feared across the territory. There was steel there, and purpose that wouldn't be turned aside by armies or weather or anything else. My grandmother was a medicine woman. Her bones were taken from their sacred resting place by soldiers who thought they were collecting curiosities. For 3 moons, I have tracked the men who violated her grave. The implications of her words settled over me like a lead blanket. She wasn't just here to recover stolen property. She was here to fulfill a sacred obligation, the kind that Apache warriors would die for without hesitation. And the trail led here, I said. The trail led here. From the front window, Pete called out quietly, "Zeke, you better come see this." I joined him at the window and felt my blood turn cold. On the ridgeline to the north, barely visible against the snow, figures were moving. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, positioned where they could watch our trading post. To the south, dust clouds marked the approach of what had to be Davies's patrol, returning with reinforcements. "We're caught in the middle," Pete said quietly. I looked back at the woman, understanding finally dawning. "The artifacts Davies described, you know where they are, don't you?" Her silence was answer enough, but what made my knees weak was the sudden, terrible realization of what that might mean. After Davies and his patrol disappeared over the southern ridge, I couldn't stand the weight of not knowing anymore. The woman's words about following a trail kept echoing in my head, mixing with my own guilty memories until I felt sick. "We need to talk," I told her. She nodded, like she'd been expecting this moment. I led her to the back room of the trading post, where I kept my private things. Pete followed, sensing something important was about to happen. With shaking hands, I moved aside some supply crates and pried up a loose floorboard. The hiding place had been there since I'd built the post, a secret compartment I'd told myself I'd never use. But when certain opportunities had presented themselves over the years, times when cavalrymen had offered to trade items they'd acquired on patrol, I'd convinced myself that preserving Indian artifacts was better than letting them be destroyed. That was the lie I'd told myself anyway. What came out of that compartment made the woman gasp and Pete curse under his breath. Wrapped in oilcloth were the very items Davies had described: a sacred medicine bundle, painted ceremonial objects, and most damning of all, a collection of bones carefully arranged in traditional Apache burial style. "Jesus Christ, Zeke," Pete whispered. "What have you done?" But I was watching the woman. She'd gone completely still, staring at the bones with an expression I'd never seen on a human face before. Grief and rage and recognition all mixed together. "Grandmother," she whispered in Apache, then switched to English. "These are my grandmother's bones." The weight of what I'd done hit me like a physical blow. For 7 years, I'd been keeping a medicine woman's remains hidden in my trading post like stolen goods. 7 years of dishonoring the dead while telling myself I was preserving history. "I didn't know," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "You knew." Her voice was deadly quiet. "You knew these were sacred. You knew they belonged with my people, but you kept them anyway." She was right, and we all knew it. I'd known exactly what these items were when I'd acquired them from a cavalry sergeant who'd needed drinking money. I'd just chosen to ignore the implications because it was easier than facing what I'd become. "The sergeant who sold them to me," I said, forcing myself to meet her eyes. "He said they came from a raid near Canyon de Shelly, said the old woman had been some kind of witch doctor." "Medicine woman," she corrected sharply. "Healer. Keeper of our traditions, and now her bones cry out from this wooden box while her spirit cannot rest." Pete was looking at me like he'd never seen me before. "How long, Zeke? How long you been keeping this secret?" 7 years, I admitted. The room went quiet except for the sound of my own guilt echoing off the walls. 7 years of living with stolen remains under my floor while trying to convince myself I was just a simple trading post keeper who'd left his violent past behind. "There's more," the woman said, examining the other items in the bundle. "These painted objects, they're not just ceremonial, they're maps." She spread out several pieces of hide covered with symbols and markings I'd always assumed were decorative. But as she traced the patterns with her finger, I began to see they were actually quite specific: landmarks, water sources, and what looked like locations marked with special significance. "Maps to what?" Pete asked. "To other burial sites." Other places where sacred objects are hidden. She looked up at me with eyes like flint. My grandmother was the keeper of 7 sacred sites. This bundle contains the location of them all. The implications hit me like an avalanche. If cavalry units got hold of this information, they could systematically loot every sacred site in Apache territory. The artifacts Davies had mentioned weren't just grave goods. They were intelligence that could lead to the destruction of an entire people's spiritual heritage. That's when old Pete made a sound like he was choking. I turned to see him clutching his chest, his face gray as old pewter. Pete! He collapsed against the wall, breathing in short, painful gasps. His weak heart, which had been failing for months, had finally had enough. The shock of what we'd discovered, the weight of the moral crisis we were facing, it was too much for the old man. "Can't breathe," he wheezed. I knelt beside him, but we both knew there was nothing to be done. Pete had been living on borrowed time for years, and the stress of this revelation had pushed him over the edge. With his last breath, he grabbed my shirt and pulled me close. "Boy," he whispered, "sometimes doing right means breaking every rule you ever learned." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with a woman whose grandmother's bones I'd been keeping like trophies, while outside, 2 armies prepared to converge on our position. She looked at Pete's still form, then at me, and said quietly, "Now you must choose which man you truly are." We buried old Pete behind the trading post as the sun reached its peak, digging through frozen ground that fought us every step of the way. The woman helped without being asked, her hands working the hard earth with the same determination she'd shown in everything else. As we stood over the fresh grave, she spoke words in Apache that I didn't understand but felt in my bones. Prayers for the dead, respect for a man who'd tried to live decent in an indecent world. Pete would have appreciated that, I think. "He was a good man," she said as we walked back toward the post. "Better than me," I replied. "Maybe. But now, you have a chance to be the man he believed you could be." We didn't have long to mourn. By early afternoon, the Apache warriors on the ridge had been joined by others until I counted at least 20 figures positioned around our trading post. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted us to know they were there. From the south came the dust cloud that meant Davies was returning with reinforcements. Through my spyglass, I could make out a full cavalry patrol, maybe 30 men, led by someone wearing colonel's insignia. Had to be Brennan himself, come to collect his stolen artifacts. "They'll be here within the hour," I told the woman. She nodded, then did something that surprised me. She began painting her face with the war paint from her parfleche bag, red and black stripes that transformed her from a woman in hiding to something altogether more dangerous. "What are you doing?" "Preparing to complete my mission." She finished the paint and looked at me with eyes that seemed to burn. "My brother leads the warriors on the ridge. He will not leave without our grandmother's bones." "Your brother?" "War chief of our band. He gave me 3 days to recover the sacred objects. Today is the 3rd day." The implications settled over me like a death shroud. This wasn't just about recovering stolen artifacts anymore. This was about Apache honor, sacred obligations, and the kind of justice that didn't recognize military authority or territorial boundaries. A shout from outside interrupted my thoughts. "Hello, the post. This is Colonel Brennan, United States Army." "Open your doors and submit to search." I grabbed my rifle and positioned myself at the front window. Through the glass, I could see Brennan sitting his horse like he owned the entire territory. Behind him, 30 cavalry soldiers waited with weapons ready. "On what authority?" I shouted back. "Authority of the United States government. We have reports that stolen military property is hidden on these premises." From the ridgeline came a sound that made the cavalry horses nervous. Apache war cries echoing off the canyon walls. The warriors were making their presence known, letting everyone understand that this wasn't going to be a simple military operation. Brennan's horse danced sideways as more war cries answered the first. Soon the entire valley was filled with Apache voices raised in challenge, and I could see the colonel counting the positions with growing concern. "Mr. Hawthorne," Brennan called out, "you're harboring stolen government property and possibly hostile Indians. Open this door immediately." I looked at the woman, who was now fully painted for war and holding her knife with practiced ease. The sacred bundle containing her grandmother's bones sat between us on the table, and I understood that this moment would define not just what happened to us, but what kind of man I'd choose to be for whatever time I had left. "Colonel," I shouted back, "I'm a civilian on my own property. You got no right to search without proper warrant." "I have all the authority I need." But Brennan's voice carried less certainty now. The Apache warriors had moved closer, and everyone could see this wasn't going to be the easy recovery operation he'd planned. The woman moved to the back window and made a series of hand signals toward the ridge. Almost immediately, the war cries stopped, leaving in silence that was somehow more threatening than the noise had been. "Your brother?" I asked. "I told him to wait, but not for long." A new shout came from outside. "Zeke Hawthorne, this is your last chance. Open this door and surrender the stolen artifacts, or we'll take them by force." I looked at the sacred bundle on the table, then at the woman who'd traveled through a killing storm to honor her grandmother's memory. Pete's last words echoed in my mind. "Sometimes doing right means breaking every rule you ever learned." "What happens if I give you the bundle?" I asked her. "My grandmother's spirit finds peace. The sacred sites remain protected. My people's heritage survives. And what happens to me?" She was quiet for a moment, studying my face like she was reading something written there. "That depends on what kind of man you choose to be." Outside, Brennan was losing patience. "You have 30 seconds, Hawthorne. Then we're coming in." I could hear the cavalry soldiers dismounting, preparing for assault. From the ridge, Apache warriors were moving into final positions. In minutes, this whole valley would erupt in gunfire, and a lot of good men would die for the sake of bones and honor and the kind of justice that never fits neat into military regulations. The woman placed her hand on the sacred bundle, and I saw something in her eyes that made my decision for me. "Tell your brother," I said, "that he's about to get his grandmother back." She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her, and made another series of hand signals toward the ridge. "Hawthorne!" Brennan shouted. "Time's up!" I picked up the sacred bundle, took a deep breath, and walked toward the door. Whatever was about to happen, at least I'd face it knowing I'd finally chosen the right side. I stepped outside that trading post carrying my grandmother's bones like they were made of pure gold, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Brennan sat his horse 30 yards away, 30 cavalry soldiers spread out behind him with rifles ready. On the ridge above, Apache warriors watched with the patience of men who'd been fighting for their survival since before any white man set foot in this territory. "That's far enough, Hawthorne," Brennan called out. "Set down that bundle and step away." "Can't do that, Colonel. You're interfering with official government business. That's treason." I laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Government business? You call grave robbing government business?" Brennan's face darkened. "Those artifacts are property of the United States Army, acquired through legitimate military operations." "Legitimate?" I held up the bundle so everyone could see it. "These are the bones of an Apache medicine woman, stolen from her burial site by soldiers looking to make drinking money." "How's that legitimate?" A murmur went through the cavalry ranks. Most of these boys had signed up to fight Apache warriors, not to desecrate graves and steal from the dead. They were starting to understand what they'd really been sent here to do. "Sergeant Morrison," Brennan snapped, "arrest this man for treason and recover that property." But Morrison, an old soldier who'd served with honor for 20 years, didn't move. "Sir, if what he says is true about those being human remains—" "You'll follow orders, Sergeant." That's when the woman stepped out of the trading post behind me, painted for war and carrying herself like the warrior she'd always been. The sight of her sent a ripple of uncertainty through the cavalry ranks. She was clearly Apache, clearly dangerous, and clearly not afraid of 30 armed men. "Colonel Brennan," she said, her English now perfect and clear, "I am Ayana, daughter of Chief Nalnish, keeper of the sacred places. These bones belong to my grandmother, stolen from their rest by your soldiers." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "You're under arrest for leaving the reservation and theft of government property." "I have stolen nothing that was not already stolen from my people." She walked up beside me, close enough that I could smell the war paint and the courage radiating from her like heat from a fire. That's when she said something that changed everything I thought I knew about our situation. This man could have killed me the moment I revealed who I was, she announced, loudly enough for everyone to hear. I have been in his power for 3 days, carrying weapons he discovered, pursuing a mission he could have stopped with a single word to your patrol. The implications of her words hit me like lightning. She was telling everyone, cavalry and Apache alike, that she'd been vulnerable, that I'd had every opportunity to betray her mission and claim the reward, but had chosen not to. More than that, she continued, when he learned that his own actions had contributed to the desecration of sacred sites, he chose to make amends rather than hide behind military law. Brennan was starting to look uncomfortable. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. Sergeant Morrison, I gave you an order. But before Morrison could respond, something happened that nobody expected. From the ridgeline came the sound of a single Apache warrior riding down toward us at full gallop. The man was clearly a war chief, painted and armed, but carrying a white flag of truce. He rode straight into the space between the cavalry and where we stood, then dismounted and walked directly to the woman. They spoke in rapid Apache for a moment, then he turned to face me. I am Nyalnish, he said in English, almost as good as his sister's. This man has shown honor. He will be allowed to live. Now wait just a minute, Brennan sputtered. This is still United States territory, and I have jurisdiction here. Nyalnish looked at him with the kind of contempt usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your boot. You have jurisdiction over thieves and grave robbers. This man is neither. That's when I realized the final twist in this whole situation. The woman, Ayanna, could have killed me any time in the past 3 days. She'd had weapons, opportunity, and every justification for revenge. Instead, she'd chosen to test whether I was capable of doing the right thing when it mattered. I'd passed that test, barely, and now I was standing in the middle of what should have been a massacre, holding sacred bones while two armies decided whether to start shooting. The bones go back to their proper resting place, I announced. Anyone who wants to stop that is welcome to try. Brennan drew his sidearm. I'm placing you under arrest for treason, theft of government property, and consorting with hostile Indians. But before he could say another word, Sergeant Morrison stepped forward with his own weapon drawn. Colonel, I served 20 years with honor, and I won't be party to grave robbing. Stand down. That's when the shooting started. The gunfight was over almost before it started. Brennan had drawn on me, thinking his rank and authority would carry the day. But he'd forgotten that Sergeant Morrison was an old soldier who'd seen enough corruption to last a lifetime. Morrison's shot took the colonel in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse and sending his pistol flying into the snow. The Apache warriors on the ridge held their positions, watching but not intervening. They'd come for their grandmother's bones, not to start a war. And Nyalnish had made it clear that this was about justice, not revenge. Most of the cavalry soldiers looked relieved that someone had finally called Brennan out. They'd been following orders they didn't believe in, conducting operations that made them ashamed to wear the uniform. Morrison stepping up gave them permission to remember what they'd actually sworn to protect. Corporal Davies, Morrison called out, tend to the colonel's wound. Rest of you, stand down. This is over. I looked at Ayanna, still holding her grandmother's sacred bundle. What happens now? Now we return her to where she belongs. The ceremony took place 3 days later, high in the mountains at a sacred site that had been in Ayanna's family for generations. I was allowed to attend, partly because I'd returned the stolen remains, but mostly because Ayanna had vouched for me. Watching them lay her grandmother to rest properly was one of the most moving things I'd ever witnessed. The Apache treated death not as an ending, but as a transition, and there was something beautiful about seeing this medicine woman's spirit finally freed to join her ancestors. She can rest now, Ayanna told me as we stood overlooking the burial site. The sacred places are safe. What about the maps? The other locations? She smiled, and I understood that she'd been 3 steps ahead of everyone from the beginning. Those maps were painted by my grandmother specifically to mislead grave robbers. The real sacred sites are known only to the medicine keepers, and they will remain hidden. I laughed despite myself. Even from beyond the grave, the old medicine woman had been protecting her people's heritage. "And what about us?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Ayana looked at me with those dark eyes that had seen through every pretense from the moment she'd collapsed at my door. "You have given my family great honor by returning our grandmother. That debt can never be fully repaid." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She reached out and placed her hand on my chest, over my heart, the same gesture she'd made that first day when trust had begun to grow between us. But this time it felt different. Not like a beginning, but like an acknowledgement of something that could never be. "My place is with my people," she said quietly, "and yours is here, building the bridge between our worlds that Pete always believed was possible." She was right, and we both knew it. What had grown between us was real, but it belonged to that space between worlds where two people could see past everything that divided them and recognize something human and sacred in each other. Taking it into the everyday world would diminish it, maybe destroy it entirely. "Will I see you again?" "Perhaps." The trading post sits on old paths between the territories. Travelers stop there for many reasons. She mounted her horse and prepared to ride back to her people. But before she left, she turned back one more time. "Ezra Hawthorne," she said, using my full name for the first time. "You are no longer the man who helped steal my grandmother's bones. Remember that." Then she was gone, riding toward the mountains with her brother and the other warriors, leaving me standing in the snow with the knowledge that I'd been given something rarer than gold, the chance to make amends for the worst thing I'd ever done. I rebuilt the trading post into something Pete would have been proud of, a place where Apache and white folks could meet on neutral ground, where fair dealing and respect mattered more than the color of a man's skin or the language he spoke. It wasn't easy, and it didn't solve all the problems between our peoples, but it was a start. Sometimes, late at night when the wind was right, I'd think I could hear Apache drums in the distance, and I'd remember a woman who'd taught me that courage isn't about having the fastest gun or the loudest voice. It's about being willing to see the sacred in another soul, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. The sacred bundle was buried where it belonged. The medicine woman's spirit was at peace, and somewhere in the mountains, the Apache kept their traditions alive despite everything the world had tried to take from them. That's justice, I suppose. Not the kind you read about in law books, but the kind that matters when you're trying to sleep at night knowing you did right by people who deserved better than they got. And sometimes, if you listen close enough, that's all the redemption a man needs. Now, friends, I've been telling stories round campfires for more years than I care to count, but this here tale always gets me thinking about what it means to do right when everything you've been taught says you're doing wrong. See, Zeke could have followed orders, kept his mouth shut, and lived safe behind the rules that other men made for him. But sometimes a man comes to a place where he's got to choose between the law and what's just, between what's easy and what's right. That Apache woman, she showed him something he'd forgotten in all his years of carrying guilt like a stone in his chest. That honor ain't about following orders. It's about recognizing the sacred in other folks, even when they don't look like you or talk like you. Every soul walking this earth carries something sacred inside them. Might be their grandmother's bones, might be their children's future, might just be the simple dignity of being seen as human. When we take the time to really see each other, past the color of skin or the language we speak, that's when something holy happens between people. The kind of love that changes a man don't always come with pretty words or easy endings. Sometimes it comes quiet, like snow falling in the mountains, and it asks you to be better than you ever thought you could be. That Apache woman and that old cavalry scout, they found something that lasted longer than the winter storm. They found the courage to see the person behind the enemy. So next time you meet someone the world tells you to fear or hate, remember this story. Remember that courage ain't about having the fastest gun or the loudest voice. It's about being willing to see the sacred in another soul, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered and shared. If this tale touched something in your heart the way it did mine, pass it along to someone who needs to hear that redemption is possible, that love can cross any divide, and that doing right sometimes means breaking every rule you ever learned. Because in the end, friends, love remembered is what makes us human.